All right, everybody, we've got one more division to cover. We're going to be covering the North Division now. We've got three guests on with us this time. One's going to be covering two teams and helping me out a little bit. We've got Kevin Armstrong here with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Hey, Kevin, how you doing?
Hey, great. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for coming on. Matthew Zator, who covers the Vancouver Canucks. Matthew, how you doing?
Doing good, Jim. How you doing?
Good. And Colton, who does a lot of the shows with me for the Oilers Overtime podcast, Colton Pankiw is with us. Colton, how you doing, buddy?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good, good, good. Okay, so let's start, Colton, with you because we're going to have you cover two teams here at once. Let's go to Calgary a little bit. We now know, or at least we think we know, they're probably sellers, right? It's really unrealistic for them to think that they've got a decent shot at this thing. So, what's the big storyline coming out of Calgary that they're selling? Do you think a lot of that's going to happen this season, or are they more of a team that's going to do stuff in the offseason?
Yeah, I mean, they have a couple guys here that might get moved. Derek Ryan's one that's getting talked about a fair bit. But I think the big changes, you hear the Gaudreaus, the Monahans, stuff like that. That's stuff that with any team, I think those big ones are generally in the offseason. So I think there'll be some big things that come in Calgary, but not at the deadline.
Who's the most likely player moved? Is it David Riddick? Is it Derek Ryan? Sam Bennett's been talked about a lot, but he's been playing pretty good.
Yeah.
And Daryl Sutter seems to think like maybe he's sticking around. So who's the guy that you think gets moved here?
I think since Bennett's still an RFA at the end of the year, I don't think they're as desperate to move him right now. Riddick makes a lot of sense just because teams were so after goalies, especially with the waiver wire and everything this year. But I still think Derek Ryan's the guy. If anyone does get traded, he'd be my number one pick.
And do you think that we're in for a massive shakeup here in Calgary? Like they've now hired a coach they said is not going anywhere. So we now
Yeah.
know that Daryl Sutter is going to be running that bench regardless of what happens here. So does Tree Living really shake this up? Like, is it a lot of talk or is it kind of like, no, there's going to be fire. Like he's going to do some stuff here.
I think he has to. He's definitely on the hot seat. He's been there for 7 years, and they haven't had really any playoff success. And then there's this year. So I think he's tried to hold on to that core for quite a while now, and clearly it's not working. So I think there'll be I thought last season there'd be, or last offseason there'd be a big one. I'd be shocked if nothing happens this offseason. I think Gaudreau likely, if not Gaudreau, then Monahan, but I'd say likely Gaudreau is in a different jersey next year.
Is there something you'd like to see them do as a fan, as a person who covers the team? Is there one play that you'd like to see Calgary make that you think is realistic for them?
Um, I mean, there is like I had heard a couple different guys talking the last few days, and then I had wrote a post on it. I don't know how likely it is, but just giving the Buffalo a call regarding Jack Eichel. They'll have some cap space next season. They have some good pieces, some good young guys, and then obviously a good starting point like Gaudreau. So I think it'd be interesting to at least try. Obviously, that would be a huge haul, but I think that'd be an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Awesome. Okay, Kevin, let's move on over to you. Let's talk about Toronto. Everybody likes to talk about Toronto. When we're talking about hockey, center of the universe. We're talking about the North Division. They've been at the top of the standings, if not all season, most of the season. What do you think Dubas does here? Is he in a position where he can actually buy as much as everybody likes to talk about how Toronto's going to buy? Like, can he do it? Does he have the cap space? He pulls off a lot of stuff. Is he possible for him?
Yeah, I think it is. And the way that they're kind of setting up, he did do a little clip on the TSN broadcast a few days ago where his quote was, "It's all on the table for us." We obviously know it's not all on the table for the Maple Leafs, but he has said, and he even showed his hand a month or more ago, that top prospects he would put out there. And while everybody likes to say the Leafs are going to push all the chips into the middle of the table and go all in, Dubas has been saying that that's never been the plan, and that's not what we're going to do. We're going to be successful over the next few years, not just one season. But then he also says it's all on the table for us. So it's kind of tough. And I guess when you're a GM in this situation with all eyes on him, as you said, with the center of the universe, you can't look desperate at this point, or people are going to be taking you to the woodshed for everything that you've got in the cupboard. So he's got to play it pretty smart, or the asking price would be very high whenever Dubas calls.
So I have two-part question for you here, because we know that Dubas has said that he's open to moving a top prospect. So part one is, who is that top prospect, or who maybe even better is not in that group of top prospects that he's willing to move? And two, we know that can't be the only deal, because a top prospect doesn't come with the salary cap that he's going to need to make a money out, money in trade. So what else would have to go with that top prospect if that was a trade that was done before Monday?
it's such an interesting game when it comes to the money side of things. They've got about $500,000 in cap space right now, and that's just by pushing paperwork around that they even have that. But obviously, there's got to be somebody to go to bring in any kind of impact player that would come with this. And everybody's been looking at that player as being Alex Kerfoot. He has a $3.5 million hit and one more year on his contract. He's not been a liability on the ice, but when you look at that payroll, he's the 9th highest player, gets bottom 6 minutes. He could go if they found that player that they're really looking for. The other one that's very interesting to me, and I just don't know how it's going to work, and no one outside of the Maple Leafs facility knows, but Frederik Andersen and his $5 million hit, the guy has not been on the ice since March 19th. I don't know if it's going to be a trade just to get him off the books, and you open up $5 million to bring somebody in, and then he becomes a free agent at the end of this year, or if they move him to LTIR and use that money that way. Or does Frederik Andersen come back? Sheldon Keefe just said that he's not concerned with Frederik Andersen's progress. And does Freddie come back and suddenly you don't need a goalie there? So that's kind of the money situation at this point. As far as the picks goes, they've got some excellent prospects in the system. The Rasmus Sandins, the Nick Robertsons of the world, Rodin Amarov, their top pick from last draft. Now, when these names were thrown out, Keefe said it would take a significant deal to move those types of players. On the bottom end of that, there's Timothy Lilligren, who's only had 11 games in the NHL and has been with the Marlies for 4 years now. He could be a guy that gets moved because he does have a lot of upside potential. And then there's a couple of lower draft picks along the way that they could sweeten the pot with that are still good high prospects, but not those gems that are part of Toronto's future that he could ship out.
Now you brought up the goaltending, and I wanted to ask you about that because we've heard, we don't know what injury status is for Frederik Andersen. We've seen how great Jack Campbell has been. He's got 10 straight wins now, and that was a really emotional time for him. But there's always that little lurking injury concern in the background for Campbell. So do you think Toronto sticks with this? Like, they've said all the right things. They've said, we're not concerned about this. Nobody seems to believe them, though. So is this one of those situations where they're going to add one more and maybe see if they can get a third string just as insurance, or they're going to run with what they've got?
And that's, again, kind of back to what I said at the beginning, that if Keefe had have said during that interview, yeah, Andersen's on the shelf, then every time Dubas called a GM and the GM picked up the phone and saw Kyle Dubas's name on there, the price tag for his goaltenders is going to double, right? So they've got to say that we still have our number one when the season started available. I don't know, but to me, the fact that Freddie wasn't very solid for a lot of those games, even when he did play the 22 games, he needed a lot of offense in front of him. To me, I still think that they need somebody else. Every time Jack Campbell goes down and makes sprawling acrobatic saves, you kind of hold your breath and you wait to see if he's getting up fast too, because it's that knee that just kind of jerks out of place on him every once in a while, and then he's off for 2 weeks. And in a playoff situation, you're done. You're out of the round then without him. And, Michael Hutchinson, if you look at that roster, he was the guy that went the longest in the playoffs last year. So no offense to Michael Hutchinson when he was with Colorado, but he's not the guy that Toronto would be wanting in net for that playoff push that they're hoping for. So to answer your question, I absolutely think they've got to go out and get somebody to at least be the backup to Campbell and be a very solid backup.
Matthew, let's move on to Vancouver here. I'll start with the news that we heard today. Now, I'm not sure as we record this if this was officially announced by Vancouver, but Tanner Pearson, 3-year deal, 3.25, I think it is, per season. What's your take on that deal?
Yeah, it was officially announced by the Canucks. So, yeah, it's a done deal. 3.25, I'm mixed on the opinion on it. I mean, he is a veteran. He's 29 years old. 3 years on it. He's going into his 30s, and the Canucks are, I don't know what they're doing. I mean, they've got Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson contracts coming up. I mean, they're probably going to be, at this point, I'm looking at it's probably going to be a bridge deal for both those guys. I don't think they're going to, be able to do those big contracts at this point, but, signing a guy like Tanner Pearson for 3 years at a little bit over $3 million, to me, I mean, he's a great veteran player. He could still play that second line role, but on a really good team, I think he's a third, fourth line guy. And with the Canucks, all the young guys coming up, I think it's a little bit of a long 3 years, a little long for me. But as much as I love how he plays with Bo Horvat and the character he brings to the dressing room, I think it's a little bit of a long, 3 years, a little long for me. Yeah.
Well, when we talk about the deadline, we asked the Pearson question, and we talk about Thatcher Demko getting the contract as well this year. We have to know that what Vancouver plans on doing with some of their free agents, including Elias Pettersson, things like that, is going to play a huge factor as to what they can do here at the deadline. But are they declaratively sellers, and do they have assets that people are going to be interested in prior to Monday?
I think the Canucks do have assets that they could put on the market that teams are going to be interested in. With this COVID-19 stuff that's going on, most of the team on the COVID list right now, I don't know, depending on how these guys are going to be able to be recovered, if some of them have it. There are reports that some of them may not have it. They're just, the direct contact stuff. But, guys like Jordy Ben, Travis Hamonic, guys like that could be depth guys that teams would be fine getting. Even you go into the point of, Jake Virtanen and Adam Gaudette, those guys have been, talked about during the season as well as being guys that could be on the market, and the Canucks could get some, young assets for. I don't know if that's going to happen. Tanner Pearson's off the table now because he just re-signed. I don't think, that's kind of bad business to trade a guy after you sign him. That's not going to happen. And he was talked about as being a guy. Alex Edler, he probably won't waive his no movement clause, which, has been a kind of a sticking point in the past. There's been talk that he could waive it for a Stanley Cup contender. I don't know if that would happen. That would have to be Canucks declaratively saying, we're selling, this season's a bust. Trading a guy like Edler is basically signaling that that's what it is. So if that happens, that's definitely the message moving forward. But yeah, the Canucks definitely do have assets that teams may want. And, even a guy like Brandon Sutter, but there's been, rumors of, it's rumors. I mean, that he's having a hard time with COVID. And, but I mean, healthy, he's a great third, fourth line guy. And he is unrestricted free agent this season as well, this offseason. So he'd be more of a rental for a team, but if playoff teams would definitely look at him as well as a third, fourth line for the playoffs.
Does any of this, I mean, I'll just to answer, a human aspect question, does any of this really matter when we're talking about Vancouver, considering what they're going through right now? And we've heard their games are delayed. We talk about the 2 games with the Oilers this next week that aren't even being replaced. We don't know if they're going to have games to make up. Are we looking at a season? Is your hunch here that this is probably going to be most of what we like? They're not going to finish. There's no way they get in 56 games. And
the longer it goes on and the longer that, games keep getting postponed, it's looking that way. And, to crunch in with that, that extended period that the NHL has basically put in as, this is the hard date we're ending. And there's been talk about the North Division kind of playing on when the other divisions are starting the playoffs already too. So, I mean, it's getting to a point where it gets to after the deadline, the Canucks haven't played yet. And it's looking like it could be just a wash. And, the trade deadline may not even be a factor.
Colton, I'm going to move over to you to cover our last team here in detail. And you and I can toss back and forth here because we both cover the Oilers regularly here. We've talked about this on Oilers Overtime, and we think I think we're both in agreement. This is probably going to be a pretty quiet deadline. But for me, I'm starting to get the sense that maybe there's something lurking in the background here. Like, I don't know if there's no move possible because the Oilers just don't have the cap space. But do you get the sense that maybe there's a trade here that Holland could do to move some money out and bring some money in, or are we just wishful thinking here as Oilers fans?
I mean, the one that keeps popping up the last couple of days that I'm sure you've seen is the Taylor Hall, which we talked about.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I still don't see how it can happen. I don't think it makes much sense. And like, there's even talks about a sign and trade now with not just with Edmonton, but with a few teams. I still think it'll be quiet. Obviously, the one guy I really wanted to bring in was Eric Stahl for that third line center. Seems like the Glendening stuff's really died down. Derek Ryan, you're hearing a bit, but I really still don't think there's going to be anything, but who knows?
Yeah, well, the Hall stuff is interesting because they keep talking about this whole idea of him coming back to Edmonton, which would be like a whole fairy tale thing. Now, discounting how unproductive he's been this season, the talk is that they get him and Nugent Hopkins signed for both combined 12 million or less, which I just don't know how that's even possible and what money you move out. But that was Doug McLean, I guess, is the one who reported that, and he said a reliable source told him that they're working on it. Now it's just speculation, obviously, and I don't think it's going to happen, but it's always interesting that just sort of lurks in the background there, right? What about, in terms of the Oilers in general? Here's a team that's pretty front loaded. They've had some decent production from their back end in Tyson Barrie, Darnell Nurse. Is there anything that you think the Oilers really kind of need to add here? Maybe they can't, but is there a target that they should be looking for here?
I think the back end's fine. I still think if they could get that, I was big on the third line center. I think now if they could just get even a fourth line guy on the for a centerman, just with their whole penalty kill and everything being down this year, obviously with Riley Sheahan, his departure last year, I think that played a big role in that taking a hit. So I think if a guy like that, or even him himself, obviously he's in Buffalo, so maybe that's a guy they could pick up for cheap. I think if they could add something like that, but I just can't see them making a big move this year. Obviously, there's areas they need to improve. I think goaltending being one, top six forward, but I can't see any of those taking place at the deadline for them.
Yeah, I'm of the opinion that I think the Oilers think they're in pretty good shape. They're relatively healthy. They made a lot of moves this past offseason, and they've got some depth there. They've got a lot of players that people are wanting them to play, the Evan Bouchards of the world and things like that. They just aren't even inserting into the lineup because they're too concerned about wins and losses and whether or not experimenting with a young guy like Bouchard is even a good idea. So when you're in that kind of a situation, you have that much depth and that many healthy players, there's really not a huge need. Holland said at some point, the only way that I'm doing anything is if I'm clearly upgrading what I currently have. So when you've got guys in depth roles and you like what they're doing for you, you need to know whatever you're adding is going to be a clear upgrade over that position. And the Oilers don't have the money. They just don't have the way to spend it to get that upgrade unless they ship out a Cassian or a McCoskinen or a Neal. And I just don't see that as realistic. I just don't know how any team's going to want to take on a James Neal. Even teams that are willing like Chicago or San Jose to add salary, I just don't see it. So we're probably not going to have a lot to say when it comes to the Oilers. So we'll move on. But Kevin, I'm going to move over to you with Montreal because here's a team now that we thought about a week ago was done, wasn't going to do anything, had no way of doing it. Now we obviously know we can't listen to Mark Bergevin and what he says because when he's saying it, he's probably the best poker playing GM in the league. But now Gallagher's down, right? Which silver lining here, you don't want Gallagher out for the regular season, but Montreal's probably in the playoffs at this point. He's going to come back for the playoffs, it looks like. So is this the greatest situation that Montreal could have fallen into? Because now they all of a sudden have the ability to go shopping.
Exactly. They opened up some cap space miraculously. Yeah, absolutely. I don't agree. I don't believe anything Bergevin says. So it was no surprise to me when Stahl went there, and what a deal for Montreal to grab him for nearly nothing, it seems to me. And they've got a very solid player that would have looked great in Edmonton, but yeah, Montreal, I still think is up to something out there. What that could be at this point, I don't know. Covering Toronto, I feel like I'm just so anti-Montreal that it kind of makes my skin boil to talk Montreal right now. But I really, they're up to something. They're always up to something. It's those Montreal Canadiens. They're always up to something out there. So yeah, they could definitely still be making moves.
Well, Bergevin has, for lying through his teeth, he certainly has tipped his hand about the fact that he's all in this season. Like he spent more money, I think more money than almost any team in any sport in an offseason where the COVID had impacted everybody financially. He still spent a crazy amount of money. So he's all in on the season. Matthew, do you think there's somebody that they are targeting? Is it blue line? Is it a forward help? What do you think if Montreal is going to go swinging? And I do think that they will probably try. What do you think they're adding?
Well, after adding Stahl, they're pretty deep, and I think maybe a defenseman could be a depth defenseman to be added. to strengthen the blue line even more. I think that's probably something they do because their forward depth is quite good with the way Corey Perry's kind of fit in there as well. And he was a monster in the playoffs for Dallas last season as well. So, I wouldn't be surprised if he turns it up in the playoffs again. And Eric Stahl, we know what he can do too. So I think, if they do something on the forward group, I think they may go for a winger to strengthen the wings. But Montreal's that. Yeah, I think they will probably. They're not done making moves. I'll say that.
Colton, what about you? Are we looking at a situation where Montreal might be among the most active teams heading into the deadline? And a week ago, we thought they were done.
I mean, maybe, like you said, I think they did so much this offseason already, and I think Bergevin did. He was all in. And really, I think it could be, I don't know if he'll lose his job, but I think he is on the hot seat depending on how they perform this year. They've had some up and down years in his tenure there. So I do think if he makes another couple moves here, like Matthew said, I think bringing in a defenseman maybe would make sense. Out of all the Canadian teams, I think them and Toronto are probably the two most likely to add something.
Let's finish off with our final team here. Kevin, I'll start with you first. The Ottawa Senators. We know they're sellers. We knew they'd be sellers at the beginning of all this. They added a bunch of pieces that they could sell when the season started, and that was kind of their plan. How much of this do you think takes part before Monday? How much does Ottawa play a role here? Do they take on salary? Do they move out players? Can they move out a bunch of players? I mean, they're playing pretty decent hockey of late. What do you think happens in Ottawa?
Yeah, they're actually not a bad team if they didn't have to play Edmonton.
Yeah,
Jeez, unreal. But Ryan Dzingel gets talked about in Ottawa to be a piece to move, and he would be a nice addition for a playoff run for a few teams. Every goalie that Ottawa seems to put in net for their first start seems to do pretty well to start. So they've got some depth pieces. We know that they're rebuilding around a fairly young core there. So pretty much anyone that's an old guy, which in Ottawa would be 27 plus, is going to be shopped at this point. And there's some quality there. And I look back, DJ Smith was behind the bench in Toronto for a few years. And if you're a Leafs fan, maybe you're wondering if there's still some blue in his veins that he would say, we'll send him to Toronto, give him a discount. I guess not. He's in Ottawa, the rivalry now, but that's an exciting team to watch. If they didn't play Edmonton this year, then they would have been pretty good, but they'll be shipping out some assets for sure.
Matthew, is there a storyline coming out of Ottawa that you're particularly watching?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking they will be getting rid of some of their, veteran assets, older guys, because, they are, like you said, they're rebuilding. They definitely are rebuilding. They got a ton of young talent that's not just there now, but coming up. And they're going to be a hell of a team moving forward. And to add to that haul again, I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to do it. And, guys, the veterans, like I'm looking at, a guy like Chris Tierney for a playoff team. That's actually, he's a pretty good asset to trade out, and he's not overly old either. So, I mean, they could probably get something pretty good for him. And like Dzingel just got back to Ottawa and he's talking about going again. So it's going to be interesting to watch that team, not just at this deadline, but in the coming years.
I'm not sure how much interest there actually is in Dzingel. He seems to only play good in Ottawa. That just seems to be the way that it goes for him. He plays well in Ottawa and he doesn't do so great everywhere else. All right, Colton, we're going to close this thing off. I'm going to start with you. Don't have to stick within the North Division, but what is the one storyline headed into Monday that what? Just got a little note here. I totally overglanced Winnipeg. Yeah. Nobody told me. I just shot right past Winnipeg. So Colton, let's go to you.
The first time Winnipeg's been forgotten about.
Oh my gosh. I'm gonna get ridden on that one for sure in the comment section. All right, Colton, let's do Winnipeg before we move on to that last question. What happens there? We know they're looking for a defenseman. We know they're probably willing to pay pretty well for that defenseman. Do you see a particular blue liner on their radar?
Well, it's funny because I think everyone up here just kind of forgets about them in the division to begin with. Like they're kind of the team that is really under the radar because I think they're really good up front anyway. Like you said, defensemen that they could be going after. It's so tough with COVID. It's so tough to get guys that are out of the North Division. So one in particular, I mean, there's a few guys whose names are getting floated around. Obviously, I think Sami Vatanen's a guy in New Jersey that isn't playing a ton there right now, and just he's been pretty productive over the years. He's cheap. Maybe that's one that they look into. But yeah, I think they definitely need to improve their blue line if they can. But still a really good team, and not one that I think you'd want to get matched up against in the playoffs.
Kevin, I think it was you that sent me the note to remind me about Winnipeg, so I appreciate that. How big a threat do you think the Jets are this season? Like they're a pretty loaded team. If they can find the right piece there, how good will they be?
No, and you'll get the hate on that, but no disrespect, like you do forget about them, and maybe it's because we lost them for those years. You kind of wipe it off and try to forget about it and move on, that we haven't fully accepted they've been back. But man, when you watch those Jets, those top six forwards that is a loaded, talented team in that top six. So I'm with you, Colton. I see them loading up something on the defensive front. I think their offensive lines are clicking. Dubois is going to be an absolute warrior in the playoffs. And look at Scheifele, when he would have been amazing in last year's playoffs if he hadn't been hurt by somebody that plays in Calgary. And he's going to be a warrior too. So I see them getting a defenseman. They've got the Vezina guy in the net. Like, give me a break. This is a team that could really make it happen. And they add a defensive piece there, then they could really, really be a threat.
Yeah, you bring up Dubois. I think that's a very interesting point, and I'm wondering how much Winnipeg is happy that they made that trade at this point. Matthew, is there a storyline that you're watching out of Winnipeg? I'll give you like 30 seconds. What are you thinking there?
Just playing against the Jets over the years, the Canucks just have no answer for them. So I definitely know the frustration that they can pose and the threat they can pose to teams with Hellebuck and Ned and the firepower they got up front. And if they add something, I'd say on defense, definitely if they add a significant piece on the blue line, they're going to be tough to beat. And like Kevin talked about Scheifele, he can turn it up and be a monster in the playoffs. And Dubois, we know how he can play with his size and his speed. The Jets are kind of looked over, but they can come out of nowhere and beat, I'd say, anyone in this division.
All right. So before I forgot about the team, I was going to go to Colton and ask, is there a storyline that you're watching? Something, even if it's not in this division, that you're kind of paying close attention to before Monday?
Yeah, I mean, one that I've been curious about with just how bad St. Louis has been in the last couple of weeks here is what they're going to do at the deadline. They have some players that they've been rumored to be moving, like Mike Hoffman could be an interesting name. So I'm interested to see if they stand pat, if they're still buyers, sellers. They're in a tricky spot. There's them, a few teams, Nashville's another one, but I'm really interested to see what St. Louis does with some of their guys that are on expiring deals, Hoffman in particular.
Kevin, who's the name that you're watching?
It was tough. I started putting together a cheat sheet for our readers for the Leafs, and it was about 3,000 words later, and that was trying to keep it as a summary. It's really difficult. It could be just because everything's up in the air right now. But to me, obviously, the one that everyone will be watching is Taylor Hall. I think more on the name, and he had one good season with the Heart there, but he signed as a free agent when no one else wanted him for a one-year deal. So I think that gets blown out of proportion by fans more than anything. But I think it's Columbus Blue Jackets and what they're going to do with David Savard and Nick Foligno. And when I put that article out on the cheat sheet, a lot of comments came in with bringing Foligno back or to Toronto. Obviously, his dad played there. And if they could add David Savard on the blue line with that, I don't know what you'd have to pay Columbus to get those two players, but that would be a really nice fit for Toronto.
Matthew, I won't leave you out. What do you got? You got a storyline you're watching?
I mean, just generally of how busy this deadline is going to be. I mean, we had that big deal yesterday with the Islanders. That may get the ball rolling at the Florida deal today. I think it's just going to be interesting to see what type of activity there is and what activity will happen, kind of outside of divisions. I think right now, a lot of it's just kind of going on around especially in Canada, I think the North is just going to be dealing in the North. But I say in general, I think just looking at how COVID and all this stuff's going to be, how the deadline is going to play out, how much activity will be on the day, may not be as busy as we're normally used to with the craziness, and it's going to be interesting to see what type of deals actually happen.
Yeah, I'm curious to see if there's a big swinger, who that big swinger is, and if it's Florida or if it's somebody, because it's got to be like we've seen a couple deals already, which we didn't know that we would, but it's teams that had cap space that made those trades. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues, and that's the only deals we see, if it's cap space teams that do it, or if somebody gets creative and figures out another way to do some stuff, because there are some teams that want to be active, but they don't have the money and the space to do it. So they're going to have to get really creative, Toronto included, to see how they all pull that off. All right, guys, thank you very much. I appreciate you joining us for the closer look at the North Division. Kevin, Matthew, Colton, thank you for coming on. And when we get the chance to talk about all this stuff again after the trade deadline, I hope I can get you guys back on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.